Climbing Mount CMMC presents Cyber Women in CMMC. Today I am joined by Kaleigh Hood, co-founder and EVP of Optic Cyber Solutions. Kaleigh has tons of experience with walking clients through their CMMC journey, and I'm so excited to have her on this episode today. Hello, climbers, and welcome back to another episode of Cyber Women in CMMC. I am so excited to be joined today by Kaleigh Hood. Kaleigh, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you, so thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
Awesome. So for those of you guys who don't know Kaleigh, first of all, take a pause on this video and follow her on LinkedIn because she's got really great content on there. But today we are going to be talking about her journey and what her and her company are doing in the CMMC space. I'm very excited because she's got a lot of background with some things that I actually am not very familiar with, and I am excited to be educated today along with these listeners. So, but first, before we get into that part of it, Kaleigh, would you just go ahead and introduce yourself and your company and what you guys do?
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Kaleigh Hood. I'm with Optic Cyber Solutions. We're an RPO, so we work on the consulting side, helping companies get ready for CMMC, doing readiness assessments, creating policies, and helping them to really create their cybersecurity program. So it's a lot of fun to be able to work with these companies. Sometimes we're building it from the ground up. Sometimes they've got some really great things in place, and so you get to see a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's awesome. I would love to hear, so we collaborate a lot on some things, but I want to know, I've never really asked you this question before. What made you step into the CMMC space? Like, what was your kind of job before, and how did it sort of evolve to this more CMMC based, RPO role?
Right. No, that's a winding path, but it's funny how things come together. My going really far back, my degree is in chemical engineering.
Oh,
So
wow.
I got my degree and then quickly moved on and decided cybersecurity was way more fun and never actually worked in that field, but made all of my college advisors mad in the process as I had to substitute my classes and take computer security for my math elective and whatnot. But then I very quickly got into my first job was around common criteria, so commercial product evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
But doing that, I was writing standards for technology products. What kind of security features should they have? And I worked on the validation side, assessing or looking at how others were assessing these products. So again, different, but kind of, similar to what we're talking about now with these new requirements and evaluating how people are putting it just on the product side rather than the organization and the organizations themselves. And then I spent a lot of time supporting I've supported NIST on the Cybersecurity Framework team, helping them to build that out and companies use it. I've worked a lot with CMMI, spent a lot of time on maturity, working with CMMI and their cyber maturity platform. So by the time CMMC became a conversation back in 2019, it just kind of made sense to say, hey, I get to take this maturity experience, this cybersecurity requirements, looking at companies and bring it all together. So again, it's all these kind of discrete things that just kind of made sense all at once.
Wow. Okay, so I want to know your first perspective then on CMMC. When you first, because you would have seen, NIST 800 171, and you would have seen NIST 853, and you would have seen all of that before the lens of CMMC. Because for me, like Bobby told me, he was like, we're going to be doing this thing called CMMC, so you have to do your research on what these are. Do you know what I'm saying? So I immediately went into those documents with the view of CMMC, but you had the opposite because these have been around before CMMC was even made. So what was your first perspective on it?
Right. No, yeah, it's funny because I can remember giving a presentation back in 2017 2016, I guess it would have been, and saying, in 2017, guys, we need to have all the 171 requirements in place. This is coming. And then, as we know, that, didn't exactly pan out as we had hoped.
People didn't
People
listen.
didn't listen to my presentation.
Yeah.
But, we were, talking about it all the way back then, and then, and kind of watching what people were doing, so that when the conversation came up in 2019 of, hey, we need to add this validation aspect, the conversation was, well, how do you do that? What is that program going to look like?
Yeah.
What's the, how sophisticated does this need to be? What are the certifications? And then all the conversations from there that we've been hearing over the last, I guess, 6 years now about, is this we're going to be able to do an assessment in 4 hours and it'll cost, $1,000 to, millions and millions. And just, it's been such an interesting ride over the last 6 years to see how the program's been developed. It's so exciting now that it feels like we're actually getting momentum and it's here and things are moving.
Yeah. So when you're going through something like this and giving advice to people, I could only imagine how difficult it is to consult and be a consultant when during the time of 2017 to now, many things have changed in this ecosystem. So, what was the one thing that was the hardest that you felt like as you guys as an organization when preparing people really affected the way that you prepared somebody, compared to how it started versus now preparing somebody?
Yeah, I'd say one of the biggest challenges just been the unknown. When somebody comes and the client says, well, how much is it going to cost me? How long is it going to take me?
Yeah.
And what do I need to do? And when you can't clearly answer those questions, it makes it really hard to be able to help them. And so one of the things that we've had to kind of work around to say, well, where do we know we're moving? What does the end goal look like? And how do we start moving in that direction? Even if we don't know exactly what the requirements will look like or what the date it'll be in your contract is, we know we need to make progress. We need to get there, and let's start moving in that direction so that we don't wake up and say, oh crap, I should have done this 2 years ago. And now we need to get it done in 2 weeks because we know that's not realistic. But we've also learned that a lot of people are, people want to do the right thing, so they want to, there's a lot of people with their head in the sand on the topic, but at the same time, they've got reasons. They've got a business to run. They've got other priorities. And so we know people want to do good. And so we have to find a way to come together on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you are creating or helping with documentation for NIST, I want to talk specifically about your transition into like the RPO role in helping contractors specifically. Did you feel like there was a technique or something that you learned when writing that helped you implement these things for people later on?
Yeah, I think one of the things I always remember is back when I was doing the validation of the security packages for the products.
Right.
I remember sitting in a room and we'd have these quarterly meetings where we all get together and make sure everybody's speaking the same language and talking about, okay, well, this requirement says we need to check, I can't remember what it was. We need to check something. And one validator said, okay, great. They check it, move on. They wrote up a little thing. They said they checked it, fine. Somebody else said, oh, no, I need to see a paragraph that says what they saw when they checked it, what they found, and the details. But so you had all these people in the room that are saying, for something as simple as check that this is in place. And there was like 5 different interpretations of what that meant.
Yeah.
And these are, this is an established program. And so from the consulting side now, I think, how do I reduce ambiguity? How do we make sure that somebody that may not know what I mean, that's kind of our joke of, I know what I mean, but does everybody else know what I mean?
Right.
And how do we reduce that ambiguity so that someone can pick up, our SSP, a policy, some kind of procedure, and know what I mean 6 months later, not just tomorrow when I explain it to them.
Yeah.
But because there is still a lot of ambiguity in the program and what people expect to see. So how do we give them the confidence that we know what we're doing and we're doing it right?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I really love you guys have a passion about CRMs and making the right CRM, and I love hearing your perspective on that. And you even have I'm pretty sure on your website, like a template or example version that people can get to, which I could link in the description below so people can check it out. But for people who might not know, a customer responsibility matrix is a necessity when in the CMMC space. It's what identifies, who is doing what so that there's no inconsistencies or lines that are crossing or not right or lines that aren't even connected properly. So
Right.
I would love for you to share your perspective on specifically coming up with that and maybe some of the tricky parts of it or the things that you've learned when creating one.
Yeah, no, it's become such a kind of a sticking point with, nobody does anything in a vacuum these days. Everybody has service providers, everybody has, whether it's an MSP or a
Yeah.
cloud service provider, we all have other people we rely on. And so, and as we do that, there's all these assumptions that we make, and there's marketing material that says they're doing it. But the more we work with people and you get into the weeds and you say, oh, like back in the, when I was doing the product certification, there would be a special common criteria mode or a mode you have to turn on that
Right.
if you don't turn it on, it's not providing those protections, but you got to do it. So there's a handoff there. And the same thing now, we'll talk to companies that have, MSPs or other service providers that, and then you'll have, as you talk through it, and they're like, oh, we never turned that on because you didn't tell us to. I'm like, but I'm paying for that. So there's just all
Yeah.
this connective tissue
Wow.
that has to be there.
Mhm.
And so that's why we wanted to create the template. And it's just a basic template, but it provides a place to write it down and say, this is what I'm doing. This is what I think you're doing. Is this actually what you're doing? And just a way to have that conversation, because so much of it, I feel like so much of the value of what we do is just in facilitating conversations and
Yes.
and like double checking. When you say you do this, does that mean this or does that mean that? Because there's so much ambiguity. And people don't mean to be vague, but it's just, we make so many assumptions as we talk. So having it all documented in a CRM, I think, is such a great way to capture it because it's in black and white on the paper, and we can get everybody to sign off and say, this is what I'm providing, this is what I'm doing, this is what you need to do, which I think is why it's so critical to get that from your ESPs and cloud service providers, and so that if there is a setting that you have to turn on for FIPS mode or whatever it might be, that to flip the switch because it's there, you just got to do it. But it's just back to that clarity of knowing what those expectations are. So we find that there's a lot of light bulbs go off whenever you start walking through and having those kind of conversations.
Yeah, so when creating that template CRM, what was something that really stood out to you that you were like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about this, but this is something critical that would be very helpful for a CRM to have, like those key components that maybe people don't think about. I'm saying this in the perspective because maybe there's somebody listening to this that is trying to connect with CSPs, cloud service providers or external service providers, and they don't know what to look for. And so what are some things that when you have created one or helped clients walk through creating one too, what are those key points?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's one of the first things that comes to mind is a lot of times when we see a CRM, sometimes it will say the requirement back. So it will say, do you have the appropriate access control permissions? And yes, I have access controls in place. And so you have to kind of step back and say, do I know what they're actually doing here? Does this give me any additional information than what is actually in the requirement? Because there's so many, sometimes it's in SSPs or CRMs where we just kind of, especially for people that are less experienced with CMMC, and I mean, you have to start somewhere. But it's so easy to say, yes, we implement encryption on all of our devices. Well, what type of encryption? When you say all devices, do you really mean all of them? Is it the same, the same encryption mechanisms on all of them? But to kind of step back and say, am I learning anything new? If I was going to assess this, would I know how to assess it? What am I looking for? What are those attributes? So sometimes it's just digging a level deeper and saying, am I really learning something here? Or is this kind of marketing level information, which is, has its place. Of course, we have to start there. But when we're talking about a CRM, it needs to be at a more detailed level.
Yes. Yeah, that's so good. You've mentioned an SSP, and for some people who are tuning in that maybe are less familiar, a system security plan is also required during your CMMC journey. And people like Kaleigh and what her organization does will help you along this journey of creating these documents. But I really want to hear too, Kaleigh, your perspective on creating a system security plan, and then like the connection between the CRM and the SSP. What are key things that you learned when walking clients through that as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's so easy to get overwhelmed by all of the documentation. That's one of the things when I talk to somebody new about CMMC, they're like a CRM and an SSP and
What
CMMC
are all
and
these acronyms
L2 and
getting on my
what does all
face?
of this even mean? But when I think about it, it's really the SSP is your kind of your central point. It's your management tool. You can use it to manage all of these other artifacts, whether it's your CRM or your policies and procedures. And so I like to think of the SSP as almost your script for the assessment. This is where you're going to capture all of those key points, have pointers to other documents. If you're copying and pasting from other documents, you probably have too much in your SSP. It's going to be long enough anyway.
Right.
But it's that central management tool that you can use so that when you're in the moment and the assessor says, well, how do you evaluate or how do you know that this is in place? You can say, well, I know my policy says this, I know my procedure says that, and it says, my ESP is providing this information. You want to have all that in one place. And so I think of it as kind of being that connective tissue for so many of the other artifacts that are needed.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. Well, I do want to tease because I can't help but mention this. Something that we are collaborating on right now, too, is the struggle with understanding us as an external service provider and how we connect to our clients, and the SSP that we have that our clients call back to ours. And there's like the talk of inheritance between the two. And we've been really, I mean, it has definitely been an experience of like going around and around with assessors and people and what we could do and what we couldn't do. And I feel like I'm learning a lot in the process of understanding exactly what an SSP entails and what a CRM entails and how they connect together, and the ways that you can utilize an ESP through them. I'm curious your perspective on that and some things that you've learned with that connection piece. Is there any things that really stood out to you when we're trying to, battle this journey of figuring that out?
Right. No, that's, I think a friendly battle is right. There is no right answer
Right.
exactly yet, where
Yep.
everybody's still kind of figuring, I mean, we know the direction, we know the high level requirements, but the execution, it's still what we're trying to figure out in the weeds of what does that look like.
Hmm.
And so there's so many different ways. I mean, if you talk to different RPs and different, CCPs and CCAs, they'll have different perspectives on exactly the way to look at it. But again, I kind of go back whenever we start, spiraling a little bit on what are we doing, is saying like, what is the goal? Like, what are we
Yeah.
trying to prove? What are we trying to say? And how can we make that point, as clear as possible? And sometimes it's, adding more words and writing it all up and referencing it all around. And sometimes it could be taking away. I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, but
No,
I
no,
think
that's
it's
good. Yeah. I feel like that could be applied to multiple different areas, because I think like any organization that is trying to implement CMMC is going to see that same, maybe a little bit of a struggle, but I think it's a good struggle of understanding your policies and procedures, your SSP internally, and your CRM, and how that connects to potentially vendors or ESPs or whatnot. All of that, like there's so many connections and there's so many parts that are pulling, that you're going to find those pieces like what you're saying, where you kind of almost go, what is the goal here, and like how can I really just accomplish it? Like, you kind of gotta step back, for a second,
right.
because you can get so caught up in the weeds of it all, because it is a lot of connections. So I definitely see where you're coming from for that, for sure. um I want to step back just a little bit about the way that you came into the CMMC space. We talked about this a little bit before off camera, but a passion of yours is the CSF. And I would love for you to explain what that is to people who are unaware, and maybe the connection between that and CMMC and how you got into that.
Yeah. So yeah, the other hat that I often wear is around the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So
Right.
it is a voluntary framework that was put out originally back in 2014. It's a set of one of the main distinctions is it's a framework. It's a set of outcomes that organizations can achieve organized through a hierarchical approach. So you probably recognize the now 6 functions: govern, identify, protect, respond, and recover.
Mm-hmm.
But it's telling us kind of what you need to do, but not how to do it. And then when I think about CMMC, it's based on the NIST SB 800-171 requirements, and that are the control framework built off of 853. So now we got all kinds of NIST controls here. So it's all, related, but at different levels of granularity. So you've got the framework, which can provide this structure that says you need access control, you need to be protecting, or have data security, you need to have an incident response plan. And then for CMMC specifically, you can take some of the requirements and the control language to say, when I build out my access control plan, I need to have these criteria, these assessment objectives that I'm going to be assessed against, and build that in. So they tell us, they give a little more information on what we need to do, not just that outcome we're looking to achieve. So I do, I really, I enjoy the different use cases. Like I said, CSF is voluntary, but it's been widely adopted across, industry and, not even just the US, the whole, the world. We see international adoption all over the place. And CMC is, as it grows and expands, we were seeing, just at the town hall this week, talking about all the international use cases that are now as it's expanding.
Yeah.
So that's great to see. But they can be used together, and they're not exclusive. Like I said, you can use the cybersecurity framework as that structure to say, these are my high level objectives. And then if we're concerned with CMMC, especially for DIB contractors that are forced to be concerned with it, we can build that in and make sure that we're covering those topics, because it is also focused on confidentiality. That's one thing I think a lot of times it's overlooked is the cybersecurity framework is meant to cover, CI and A, confidentiality, integrity, availability. When the 171 requirements were pulled out of 853, it was pulled out with a focus on confidentiality of this information. Not that there's not some integrity and availability in there, but it's a much larger
focus. Yeah.
Right. It's a much larger set of controls that would be needed. And so I like using CSF for that broader approach, and then CMMC for that specific, compliance requirement to protect the confidentiality of that CUI.
Wow, I love this. I want to hear your perspective on, if a government contractor was listening to this and they kind of heard, you've talked about the framework itself, you talked about CSF, you've talked about 853, you've talked about 171 and CMMC. I would love to hear, if they were starting off, would you recommend them like kind of learning about CSF first and then flowing down to maybe some other things? How do you see those, connections playing with somebody starting their journey of understanding?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think really, usually it kind of comes back to that compliance driver. When we talk with different people, usually if you have a requirement for CMMC, it's probably best to start with that and focus on, the requirements out of 171, because we know that can be a long road if we're just getting started. But if you don't have the requirements for CMMC and you're maybe newer to the concept of cybersecurity and you're trying to build out your program and what do I need, where should I focus? I like the idea. We often recommend to start with the CSF because of that hierarchical approach, where you can start with the functions and say, let me identify what I have. I've got a couple laptops, I've got this, I've got that, and then you can kind of dig into the weeds and then build your requirements in. A lot of time, we do work with a lot of organizations to use the framework as a as a way to kind of build in other requirements, because there's so many. If you're in a regulated industry and you've got 12 different compliance standards you're trying to meet at the same time, you don't want to build out 12 different compliance programs. And so the
Yeah.
CSF can be a great way to integrate that. But
Mm.
if you know you have CMMC requirements and that's your primary focus, I don't want to stand in your way. You gotta make progress on those
Gotta
requirements.
move forward. Yeah.
You're right.
It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of the crunch time versus maybe wanting the full picture if you had the time to be able to do it all, what it would
Mhm.
look like. What about with CSF? Like, I mean, you've shared this, but it seems as though that was around before CMMC, right? So CMMC is not necessarily the only reason that CSF was created. It was before. So the framework and utilizing different security and compliance approaches does not necessarily fully have to do with CMMC. What are some of the compliance or controls that it really focused on before CMMC was even a big thing? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, is it like the ISO world? Do you get what I mean about that kind of side? Or what was it really focusing on before?
On what CSF was focusing
Yeah,
on before.
right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so CSF, it definitely takes that broader approach. So it was initially created as the framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity.
Yeah.
So it was created out of an executive order to build out guidance and a structure for U.S. critical infrastructure to know, what do I need to do? What are these outcomes I need to achieve? But be written, it was given a specific limitation not to be written at a level that told them what to do. Because when we're
Right.
talking critical infrastructure, we're talking about utilities, we're talking about retail, we're talking about IT, we're telecom, and all these different industries that do very different things, have very different business requirements.
Mm.
And so it needed to be, and that's why the framework is at a higher level than
Yeah.
like the controls and the assessment objectives of in CMMC, because it was meant to be more flexible. I mean, you can tailor things in and out. They don't tell you how to do it, but because it's so flexible, that's why I do like to use it as that structure
Mm.
for building compliance requirements into. For where we do have those specific requirements, like CMMC, I can say that 3.1.1 maps to ID AC,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
AA, I guess now, and build that in. I know everybody keeps changing the identifiers.
Yeah. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Right.
Yeah. No, I get what you mean. Yeah, I mean, I don't really, again, I said like I came into this space just knowing about CMMC, so CSF like as a main just I mean, framework as itself is very new in my understanding of that. So it's really cool to hear that perspective. I really would love to know from you as well when creating, you know, NIST documentation. And we talked to Dr. Ross about this on Climbing Mount CMMC one time, but you've even talked about this when discussing the framework. Is the more general understanding of things rather than getting specific. So when writing these documents and these things in the past, it was more like let's keep it broad so that multiple people can use it on multiple different areas. But like we talked about before, about, an SSP or a CRM, it's the complete opposite. You have to get specific because if you're broad, you will not pass an assessment with those things. So that is like very like dueling, perspectives, and you've done both of them. So was there a struggle when switching to kind of writing these more specific things versus maybe how you used to write some documentation in the past?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I've shifted, or because whenever we write the policy suite for, or we're working on building things out for a company, we usually are writing it more specific. So where
Yeah.
like the cybersecurity framework will say, we're inventorying, hardware and software assets. So whenever we write out, what they're doing, we have to write enough so that they know what they need to do.
Yeah.
So,
Right, right,
but
right.
but now we've got that with CMMC. We also have to make sure we're checking ourselves. Not just does the organization that we're helping know what they need to do, but will a third party coming in also understand what we mean? So it's back to that. Do you know what you know what I mean? I know what I mean. I need to make sure that the organizations know what I mean and the third party organizations know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it just again becomes a big the way to communicate becomes so important.
Yes.
So I don't think it's been a huge shift because we've always had to provide a detail that at least the organizations know what we mean. But now we have to make sure that they can also describe it to an assessor, which sometimes can be, it is that added challenge.
Yeah. Wow. So in the CMMC space, with you guys and your company, what is your main goal that you really want to accomplish? And what would that thing be that you would want to leave people with who are listening today?
Yeah, that everybody, we can do this. We know it's important. We know we need to protect our critical information. We've seen all of the CUI being leaked and the ramifications of that. But just because it's hard doesn't mean it can't be done. And so one of my favorite things that we do is, sometimes it's the advising, and as we help people build this out, as you start the conversation, you start the day and everybody feels so overwhelmed. How are we going to do this? Who's going to do this? And then my goal is to be able to come in and say, this is possible. We're going to make a plan. We're going to write it down. We're going to use the good that you already have. Everybody's doing something. Pretty much everybody's got passwords, at least these days. We might need to up the complexity requirements, but we've got at least something.
Definitely.
But to be able to work with people to figure out how to make it happen is one of my favorite things, because it can feel so overwhelming. And that's where I've been steeped in, the standards and maturity and all of this for years. So it's it's like a second language, but
Absolutely.
Coming in, you realize sometimes when you step back and people are talking about, and the SSP and the CRM for CMMC and the SPAs and and you're like, I don't even know what you just said.
Right.
And being able to translate that for people is one of my favorite things. How do we simplify this, make it achievable? Because we can do this and we can do it together.
I love it.
So.
The last thing I want to ask you is, you in 5 years from now, what do you want to see accomplished? Are there things in your brain that you're shooting for or that you want to share? Because I love asking people this question, because it honestly really inspires me to kind of shoot for things that maybe I wasn't thinking about before, and other people listening. So are there some things for you that you really want to see happen in 5 years?
Oh, that's a great question. I should have a better answer for that.
It's okay if you don't, but
Right. No, I feel like so much of, we've been, building and creating a plan. If I think back to 5 years ago, we had just created Optic. And so looking up to where we have this, established company now is amazing. And in those, I've had 2 kids since then. And just thinking about how life has evolved is just crazy. So trying to think another 5 years, what could it be? Just being able to continue what we're doing, build up companies, have a positive impact on the organizations that are protecting this critical information. Is where I'm headed.
Yeah.
But I definitely need to think about that and probably write a few goals down.
I love it. I mean, hey, I've had a kid since then too, so life is wild. I mean, I'm telling you. I love what you guys are doing and the passion that you have behind it. I'm really excited to continue to watch and hopefully continue to collaborate on more things with you guys as we move forward. And the ecosystem's going to be wild in the next 5 years. So who knows what we're going to say. We should hop on a podcast 5 years from now, on this day, and see.
Right, there we go.
We're insane. We didn't even know.
Right, things we couldn't have even thought of, hopefully.
I know. I have a feeling that we will say that. But thank you so much for coming on here and being transparent and letting me ask you these questions. I feel like we could go on for even more, so I'd love to have you on again in the future, because just to get more into the specifics of everything and just be able to really dive into even CSF and how people can implement that would be so cool too. So thank you so much for being transparent and coming on here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm happy to join. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me to be on this podcast. I'm so excited. I've watched a few of the other episodes, and I'm just amazed at all of the other, women are so impressive, and I'm just, in awe of everybody. So I'm grateful to be able to be invited and share as well.
Oh, yes. You're invited back anytime. I love it. A fellow mom that's trying to figure out all this stuff while raising their kids. Right. Wild. A wild ride. But guys, I hope you enjoyed listening or watching wherever you are to Kaleigh and her journey. Make sure, again, if you haven't already, to follow her on LinkedIn and check out their company website if you want to know more about them. We will have another episode of Climbing Mount CMMC this coming Thursday, so make sure to tune into that. But until then, guys, keep on climbing. See ya.